One of the things with Frank is that if he said he would do something, he did it. Now, no matter at what cost to himself. So if he said, I'm going to break your nose at 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, the fact he knew he was going to get a hammering from the prison officers, would go on bread and water, would lose his remission, would not stop him in any way. He would break your nose at 9 o'clock.
James Morton was an experienced criminal lawyer. In the early 90s, he was invited into the heart of the criminal world by notorious London gangster Frank Fraser, better known as Mad Frankie. Morton was asked to write a book about Frankie's life and was given a rare insight into his mind.
You have to put Fraser absolutely in the top drawer of criminals. He was there in what you would call the heyday of the London gang, from the Sabinis onwards, the Krays, the Richardsons, the Whites. He was there at the time, so you have to say, without doubt, he is a seminal figure.
This is Matt from Underworld Uncut, and this week we're with James Morton to find out about his unique insight into one of Britain's most famous gangsters, Mad Frankie Fraser.
I wrote a book called Gangland and had a bit of trouble with some people in London who didn't like what I'd written. I got home one day and I found there was a message on my answering machine which said, "Would you ring a Mr. Francis Fraser?" I couldn't see that I'd written anything particularly nasty about him, but there's no point in not facing up to things. So I rang him up and I said, "Is that the Mr. Fraser?" He says, "Yes." He said, "I've got your book and I've read it. I didn't buy it, someone nicked it for me." He said, "You've made some mistakes." So I said, "All right, you tell me what they are and I'll correct them." He said, "No," he said, "I'm writing my biography and you're going to do it for me." So my wife didn't want me to do it. My agent didn't want me to do it, but I agreed to see Frank. And so I picked a place because I was still somewhat apprehensive. And so I could, in true gangster position, sit with my back to the wall and see who came in. Frank turned up at about 4:15 with his arm in plaster. And he said, "I'm sorry I'm late. I've been to hospital. I've fallen off a ladder and broken my arm." I said, "Well, you should cancel it." He said, No. I said I was coming, and I was coming. And this is how I found him from then on, enormously easy to deal with. He had a more or less photographic recall of the London gang scene going back to the 30s, even when it didn't involve him. He was born just outside Waterloo station. There are small terraced houses, and he was born there. His mother was Norwegian. His father was Native American. The curious thing is that both his parents were absolutely straight. His father worked for Stuart Surridge, the cricket bat makers, for years. He did the boilers there. His mother had 3 jobs, I think it was. So she cleaned at ICI in the morning, then she cleaned a hotel, and then she cleaned back at ICI in the evening. So they were extremely hard-working. There were, 5 in the family? And the eldest 3 were absolutely straight children. It's only Frank and his sister Eva who went off the rails. Eva was really Frank's, I was going to say, twin in a way. She was much nearer to him in age. She had the same dark hair, aquiline profile, and they got up to all sorts of scrapes together. She was always very, very supportive of him. And they were not averse, I think, to doing a bit of pickpocketing, a bit of theft here. One of the things was the old trick, I think it was called the Murphy game. You would say at Waterloo station, "Can I carry your suitcase, sir?" And he would give you some money, and that was the last he saw of the suitcase. They were always finding a pound note here or 10-shilling note there and taking it home and saying, "Oh, look what we've found in the street," when in fact they'd pickpocketed it. Round Waterloo at the time was really, really slums. I mean, there would be no baths. I'm not even sure that there was not a communal outside lavatory for the houses, but it was really a poor area. I mean, there would be a lot of rats. There were factories there. It really was a hard life growing up in Waterloo. What would it be? I suppose middle 1920s, end of the 20s, and then you come to the Depression anyway. The Sabinis were the big racecourse gang. Although they were called the Sabinis and the Italian gang, I don't think they actually spoke Italian, but they were the racecourse protection racketeers of the end of the First World War through the 20s, through the 30s. And they were the big London villains. In those days, there would be considerable racist behaviour. The Sabinis battled against the Jewish mob, they battled against the Elephant and Castle mob, and Sabini, by all accounts, did look after the area. If you were a bookmaker at the racecourse, you paid the Sabinis 2 and 6pence for what were called the tissues, which were the racing form sheets. Another 6pence for having your blackboard wiped of the odds. And Frank was the boy, because you had to have a young boy to get a bit of sympathy from the crowd, who would go round and rub off the odds at the end of each race when they changed it from 11 to 4 to even money or whatever. And he was the bucket boy for a time, until he got a bit too old. I think they were very poor, and he wanted to make some money. I think probably poverty had a considerable effect on him, and certainly led to him going into a career of crime. In those days, the traditional way out of poverty was boxing, or sometimes being a jockey or something like that, or crime, and he went into crime. Having met the Sabinis and known of the Sabinis, then that would be a perfectly reasonable route for him to take. His teenage years, he's really a minor thief, is what it amounts to, and I think probably not a very good one, because he gets captured a number of times. It was just like so many young people from Waterloo, from the Elephant and Castle, from Islington, minor crimes. Frankie was without a doubt violent when he was young. He was a scrapper, and he was a street fighter. He had a temper, and he was very, very tough, and you really had to knock him out to keep him down. He was a very nasty opponent, and I don't suppose he played by the rules either. What he always used to say was that the problem was none of the family had been in prison, and he didn't know what to do. And he always says if he'd had Uncle Jim, who had done a couple of years, and would say to him, "Look, Frank, keep your head down, don't cause trouble," he might have listened to him, but there was no one for him to talk to. And he said that once he'd had a couple of fights with warders and so on, he was a marked man. And one of the things with Frank is that if he said he would do something, he did it. Now, no matter at what cost to himself. So if he said, "I'm going to break your nose at 9 o'clock on Thursday morning," the fact he knew he was going to get a hammering from the prison officers, would go on bread and water, would lose his remission, would not stop him in any way. He would break your nose at 9 o'clock. I suppose he would regard it as a matter of honour. He said he would do it, and he did it. He could never get rid of the tag that he was a troublemaker. Frank always thought that the war years were the years that made everybody into criminals. There was rationing, and perfectly decent, ordinary housewives would want an extra bit of meat or a few eggs if they possibly could for the family, and so they wouldn't be averse necessarily to buying a few stolen ration coupons. There was, of course, the Blitz was on, an awful lot of shops got bombed, there was the opportunity for looting, the police would be stretched, and Frank always reckoned that this was a really good time to make your money, and I think he took great advantage of it. It's only really when he's in Chelmsford, a prison, he meets Billy Hill, who was the successor, as it were, to the Sabinis. Now, Billy Hill had a long career himself. From about 1940, 43, when he meets Frank, Billy Hill and, along with a man called Jack Spot, take over or begin to take over London or Soho villainy. And Frank, when he gets released from Chelmsford, has aligned himself with Billy Hill, and that's how he gets up a few steps in the criminal hierarchy. He's Billy Hill's right-hand man. He would be a sort of hard man for Hill. He would be covering Hill's back. He would be doing jobs here and there for him. Hill would be the brains. Frank would do the work. Hill had a trademark of a V slash himself, and so you knew who had been slashed by Hill because of that V. Hill also paid by the stitch, so if you put 50 stitches in a man's face, you could expect £50. And apparently people looked in the newspapers, the evening newspapers, to see the next day how many stitches had been put in their victim's face and how much they were due to be paid. And Fraser would be one of those people who would use a razor. Soho has always been a louche area, and it's always had a sort of magnetic attraction to society in one way, and also to the criminals. There's money to be made from the early 1900s. There were a string of drinking clubs run by a variety of people where you put on a dinner jacket and you mixed with villains such as the Sabinis, and you mixed with high society. For example, the Admiral Duncan in Old Compton Street was a hangout for the Sabinis. It was the home of the real major villains. And if you went to what used to be called the Windmill Theatre, just off really, Regent Street and Piccadilly, there were club after club after club, illegal drinking clubs, illegal gambling clubs. And when the police closed them down on Monday, they opened under another name. There was money to be made, is the answer in Soho. It wasn't protected territory. It was rather like, I think, Miami is regarded and Las Vegas in America, a sort of open city. There weren't really gang fights in the criminal sense. They might have well fought in Aldgate or Islington, but they didn't fight in Soho. They wouldn't necessarily go out to harm women, and you will meet people who now lovingly look back and say you could walk the streets at midnight and you'd be totally safe, and we never harmed anybody but our own. But what about the bank tellers who had a shotgun in their face? What about the people who were carrying wages who got bashed? They don't seem to count. I don't think, in all the years I've known him, I've never heard him swear. I think he was enormously well brought up. He was brought up by a family which had standards, and they instilled these standards into him. Somehow he went off the rails in a different way, but for actual innate politeness, enormously polite. At the end of the war, really the acknowledged gang were the Whites. They were a spin-off from the Sabinis, and to a certain extent they were a racecourse gang as well, and they moved into the West End. Billy Hill had no great interest in horse racing. Jack Spot had no great interest in horse racing, but he was very keen on protection. Billy Hill was far, far smarter than Spot ever was. But between them, they got rid of the Whites. Hill and Spot ran the West End with, again, a benevolent dictatorship. They took money off what was called the smudge, which were fake photographs being taken of tourists in Trafalgar Square. They ran the peanut selling rackets. So, in those days you used to sell sixpence worth of peanuts to tourists to feed the pigeons. They used to run that. They ran everything in Soho, and they ran it, and there was no trouble. But then Billy Hill had a brilliant coup. He organised a thing called the East Castle robbery. There was a post office van which they hijacked. No one was caught. Much of the money, probably around 200,000, which would be an enormous sum today, disappeared, and Billy Hill was made. In the early 50s, Billy Hill, not content with the East Castle robbery, organises another in Lincoln's Inn when a whole load of bullion goes, and Spot is now desperately jealous. Coupled and added to that, the Italians are now thinking they want the point-to-point racing back. And by 1955, there are serious ructions between Spot and Hill. Spot believes the Italians are going to attack him and that they have Frankie Fraser with them, who would be serious difficulties for him. That's when Spot recruits the Krays to look after him. In fact, it's rather pointless because Frankie's in a mental hospital by then, having attacked one or two prison officers too many. Once Frankie comes out, Hill and Spot really seriously fall out. The upshot is that Hill determines that Spot has to be dealt with one way or the other, and that is when he recruits or asks Frank to go and deal with Spot. And Spot is slashed to bits outside his flat when he's with his wife at Hyde Park Mansions just off the Edgware Road. And that is when Frank really gets his reputation and gets 7 years for it. Really, life gets intolerable for him in prison. I mean, he really just will not conform. He'll attack any prison officer who offends him. Frank gave as good as he got. He was sentenced to be flogged, and I think he was flogged once. He was saved the second time because it was thought you couldn't flog a man who'd been certified insane. So to that extent, he was fortunate. But reprisals, I suspect, were much worse because he would then be on bread and water, lose remission, would be subject to a bit of a beating here and there. But in the actual fight itself, he would be formidable. She was enormously supportive of him, particularly during his long sentences. She would traipse around the country from prison to prison, trying to make sure he wasn't being too badly treated. She was part of what was called the 40 Thieves, which had been running for years and years, probably since about 1900. Top women shoplifters who just pillaged. To be invited, actually, to join the 40 Thieves was something of an honour. She was well regarded. Frankie was devoted to her. Whatever you say were his bad points, and goodness knows there were many, he was absolutely devoted to his sister. She was in fact the rock on which he survived the sentence, really, when it came to it. During that time, Spot has retired to Ireland. Hill is now the governor of Soho for the moment. The Krays are coming up. And what happens is that when Frank is away, the Krays are starting to court Eva by arranging for her to get transport to the prisons to see Frank make life a little better for the travelling. And when he comes out, he's got the choice, really, of aligning himself with the Krays or going with the South Londoners. Eva has married into a South London family. A member of that family took a bad beating while Frank was away, and the Richardsons went and sorted it out on Eva's or on the man's behalf. And Frank now feels he really ought to be with the Richardsons. There's no doubt the Krays were good to Eva, but they wanted Frank, and I suspect they were courting Eva so that Frank would join them. But when it came to it, this one incident seems to have committed Frank, who was anyway a South London man rather than East End man, to the Richardsons. This is where you get into sort of some controversy as to what he was doing. The South London was run by partly by the Richardsons and also partly by other mobs. Charlie Richardson was a very intelligent man who was a good businessman. But according to the prosecution, and this would be denied by Fraser and always denied by Richardson, if somebody offended him, i.e. swindled him, Richardson, then the reprisals were extremely nasty. Frank was alleged to have, this was the prosecution's case, had pulled the teeth out of some man with a pair of pliers, no anaesthetic. The allegation was another had wires attached to his genitals. There was an electric box which could be attached and the handle cranked. Eric Mason was a class villain on his own account, rather more aligned with the Krays than with other people. The Astor Club was down in Berkeley Square, and it was really quite a smart place where the villains used to go on a Friday night. And it was a safe place. If the Richardsons and the Krays were there at the same time, they might not exactly embrace each other, but they wouldn't cause trouble to each other. Apparently, Mason made a remark to which Fraser took exception. And he was bundled in a car. There is, I think, no doubt that Frank took an axe to him, which is how he acquires part of his sobriquets. And Mason was left bundled up in a blanket outside the Mile End Road Hospital, or one of the hospitals down the East End, in, I think, what could be described as a poor way. Mason remained staunch and certainly never gave them up. There were allegations that Frank, who was, I think, quite close to Eddie Richardson, that they ran a parking fraud at London Airport. They also had one-armed bandits, which were put in clubs through all over the north of England. They had an awful lot of fingers or thumbs in an awful lot of pies. Frank and Eddie were regarded as hard men and would be allegedly into protection. They would tell you that they weren't protecting as such, but that they had been asked to be in a club to look after it. And you could quite see that if you went into a club with an idea to cause some trouble, and you found Fraser or Richardson, or worse, both of them sitting at the bar having a drink, you might think very carefully before you wanted to cause trouble that night. Some businessmen had run clubs in Manchester very profitably, and they wanted a London club. And they got this club over at Catford, which apparently was a perfectly nice little club. You could eat there. There was a bit of a cabaret. But Eddie Richardson and Frank Fraser were invited to look after the club. They are there one night when fighting breaks out, late at night, and a man called Dickie Hart, who was a distant relation of the Krays, is shot dead. Frank was charged with the murder and acquitted, but there is also an affray charge put on him and various other members of the Richardsons who were in the club at the time. And this is where Frank picks up 5 years in 1965. Once he's inside and the Richardsons are inside, on remand for the affray, one or two people who allege they have been tortured by them go to the police. And from that moment, with the Richardsons away, the police put together the, quote, torture trial, unquote. And that is when Frank picks up another 10 to go with the 5 he's got. So he's now got 15. I think there's no doubt that prisons in those days, the late 60s, were pretty difficult. They weren't as bad as they'd been in the 1940s and 50s, but they were still pretty hard places to be. You were having ex-servicemen who were the prison officers, who were themselves tough men. And if you were looking at a maximum security prison, you quite clearly had to be a tough man. There's also no doubt that Fraser was the governor of the prison, or the prisoner's governor. He was well respected and well feared in prison, and it's absolutely right, he would stand up if he thought another prisoner was having a bad time from the screws, he would stand up against them, not necessarily to his own benefit. And if he'd again listened to Uncle Jim and kept his head down in things which didn't concern him, then he might not have had quite such a hard time. But he saw it that it did concern him. He didn't want to see weaker prisoners being leaned on. In 1969, in a dispute over prison conditions in Parkhurst, he is then alleged to have led the Parkhurst prison riot. Well, I don't think there's any doubt he did lead the Parkhurst prison riot. And for that, he's acquitted of incitement to murder and convicted of grievous bodily harm and gets another 5, which makes 20 in total. He didn't get any remission. He didn't ever get home leave. He went away off the scene for 20 years. He came out, I suppose, the mid-80s, then goes back and does a 2-year sentence for receiving. He's now in his, middle 60s, and he never does another thing. Turned his life around. He put himself about after he came out, and he did his books. He did a cabaret act in the West End and down the East End when he told stories and someone played the piano a bit. He made a film. He was forever on television. He put himself about and made himself or reinvented himself as a minor celebrity. Once the first Frank book came out, he started to have a completely new life and a reputation. And I remember we were walking around London, he was pointing out places where villainy had occurred or something had happened, and taxis were hooting at him and giving thumbs up to him, and people were coming up and saying, would you sign this napkin, this paper serviette for us? I was once with him doing a signing down in Swindon, and afterward, he would answer questions and then sign. And some fellow turns up with an axe and says to Frank, would you mind holding it against my head so I can be photographed? And Frank says, have you bought the book, son? He said, yes. He said, of course I will then. I think he must do. I think Frank would never admit publicly any regrets, but I think he must regret that from the age of 15 to the age of 65, he must have been out of prison for about 7 years. I think he must have regretted that. His pride would not let him admit that he regretted it. And so when you ask him, do you regret something? He says, yes, I regret I didn't steal the crown jewels. He is sort of hiding something, and that would be that he did spend so long in prison. So I think he must regret that he wasn't there to see his kids grow up. I mean, he was very proud of one of his sons who played professional football, and also for a grandson who played professional football. So I think, yes, to that extent, he would be very sorry that he wasn't there to see them do well. In his day, yes, he probably was the most dangerous man because he was so committed to doing what he said he was going to do.
Frankie Fraser died on the 26th of November 2014. He was 90 years old. James Morton went on to write several books about organised crime in Britain. Thanks for watching this video about the extraordinary world of Mad Frankie Fraser, as told by his biographer, James Morton. This is Matt from Underworld Uncut. Please remember to like, subscribe and hype. It really helps the channel.